Greetings, everyone. My name is Alexis Duggan, and today I will be presenting on Disability Etiquette 101 for counselors. Now, within this presentation, we will look at a quick introduction for myself. We'll look at the history of people with disabilities. When you see the acronym PWDs, that is what I am referring to. And we will also review terminology, accessibility, barriers, etiquette, and conclusions. Now, just a quick introduction of myself. So, my name is Alexis Duggan. I am a certified rehabilitation counselor. I'm also a licensed professional counselor in the state of Texas, and I am a doctoral candidate. My history with individuals with disabilities started as a special education teacher. My bachelor's is in special education, where I worked in several counties in Florida with varying disabilities with transition age youth. So I was a middle school teacher. I work with mental health diagnosis, learning disabilities, students on the spectrum, as well as students with behavioral concerns as well. And then after receiving my master's at Florida International University, I did a little time in state VR. I went back into higher education where I started as a disability services coordinator, went on to case manager, and then ended as director. And now I am the CEO of my own business where I provide vocational expert testimony as well as mental health counseling at Dugan Diggs Disability. I've also found a new love for our veteran population and archaeology. So I have had the opportunity of providing mental health support to several archaeological digs from San Antonio, Texas to Israel, as well as Italy. And that's something that I have enjoyed doing over the past few years. So thank you for watching this presentation, and I hope that you learned something new. Now, what will I learn? So, you will be able to define accessibility for individuals with disabilities. You will be able to recognize situations where individuals with disabilities may feel uncomfortable within a counseling environment or within the environment that you currently work in, whether that is counseling or not. And then you'll also be able to develop your own plan to address disability etiquette within your own career environment. And throughout this presentation, you may notice that I am looking at multiple screens here. Now, let's start out with a few facts. So, did you know that 1 in 4 of adults in the US have some type of disability? 1 in 4 of adults with disabilities do not have a usual healthcare provider, and 12.8% of US adults have a cognition disability with serious difficulty concentrating, remembering, or making decisions. And that is a few statistics from the CDC.gov that talks about disability in health and how those things are intertwined. It's also important, that as we are talking about disability, that we remember that, most times you will not be able to see a person's disability. So there are apparent disabilities, something that you can see. For example, a person who is utilizing a mobility device, whether that's a cane, walker, wheelchair, and then there are individuals who have not apparent disabilities that you may not be able to see. So, someone who has a mental health diagnosis, you may not be able to see that. Someone who has a learning disability, you're not going to be able to see that. And I think that's important when we're talking about disability one-on-one, because many times within our culture, we always see the person who's in a wheelchair or maybe someone who's utilizing a seeing eye dog. But there are, that is not the only disability. And it's important for us to remember that. Now, on this slide, I have about 6 pictures of varying disability. Some individuals are using a mobility aid, others are utilizing Braille, um, and then others are with their family while smiling. You may notice that throughout this presentation that I will try to narrate some of the pictures. Now, let's talk about a history, for individuals with disabilities. I think it's so important that when we think about the disability community, that we start with their history because it helps you to just have a better foundation in working with individuals with disabilities. And then once we get to talking about etiquette and barriers, it's very important to remember, the things that the things that folks with disabilities have fought for. So for many years, people with disabilities, they were stripped of their civil rights, to be treated equal to their non-disabled peers. That may look like being able, to live where they want to live, being able to have an education with other individuals who don't have a disabilities, being able to just simply make decisions on their own without having someone to be there or to have to sign off on something. The disability rights movement was really birthed in response to the medical view, which is, folks with disabilities are passive recipients. They don't have self determination skills and they don't really need those skills because somebody else knows better. And individuals with disabilities and thinking about their history, they were saying the opposite that, hey, I don't want to be viewed that way. I want to be in the driver's seat of my own decisions within my own life. So I think that's very important, to remember as we look at just a quick history timeline. And if you'd like to know more about the timeline for individuals with disabilities as far as civil rights and their history, check out a book by Shapiro. That is, and the book is called No Pity: People with Disabilities Forging a New Civil Rights Movement. And it really gives just a great timeline with detail of the things that individuals with disabilities have fought for. Now, you may have noticed that I talked about the medical model within the last slide, but as we are, just giving a little overview of history for individuals with disabilities, let's look at the medical model just a bit more. Now, the medical model views the person as, or a person with a disability, as a patient in the context of a medical setting. So what does that mean? They are viewing a person with a disability as someone who needs to be fixed, right? When you go to the doctor, you're there because you want whatever it is that you are experiencing to be fixed or to be cured. So in this model, disability is seen as a deficit and it negates the aspects of identity, and meaning that, yes, I have a disability, but this is simply a part of my identity, right? There's other things that I have, to offer the world. There's other parts of me that I want to be on the forefront versus the sole focus being on my disability. And this often falls over into terminology as well, which we'll talk about that a little later. Now, in response to the medical model, the social model was developed. So the social model points out that Disability is not seen as a burden by people with disabilities, but instead the attitudinal barriers and the environmental barriers are what is really the issue here. So the fact that cannot access, your building, the fact that I cannot access my educational materials, or the fact, that my professor thinks that I shouldn't even be here because I don't have what I need in order to succeed based on my disability. So those are the barriers versus the person's disability, as well as non-disabled people's expectations. When we think about employment for folks with disabilities, many times we have seen employment options that are low paying, that don't have any upward movement. And, that is based on the expectations of non-disabled people, in that, well, surely you can only do this because you have a disability, and there are no other options, for you. That's an example of people's expectations that create barriers for folks with disabilities. And as a result of this, this may cause other effects like depression, anxiety, worry, so it's not the disability that is the issue. It's the way people are viewing the disability. It's the things that they're saying, or maybe the things that they're not saying, that they're thinking, those microaggressions, that is what is exasperating a person with a disability versus their actual disability. Now, there is a quote that I'm going to read, and it's from an article from the CDC, and it really talks to the social model perspective. So, from my point of view, I wasn't like a normal child, I was normal. From the beginning, I learned to deal with the world as a blind person. I didn't long for sight any more than I yearned for a pair of wings. I premised my life on the conviction that blindness was a neutral characteristic. So, this is a person who is blind, who was born blind. And I think it's very interesting, that this person is saying that, hey, I never thought about having sight. This is not something that I long for or that I wanted, which is sometimes, going back to those expectations that we, as non-disabled people have, for folks with disabilities, don't you, well, I'm very sure, and that you wish that you could walk or that you could see or that you could do XYZ. And here's a person with a disability who's saying, no, I was always normal. This is not even something that, kind of came up within my mind. My blindness was just a neutral characteristic. And I think that's very eye-opening when we think about the social model and when we think about the expectations of non-disabled folks. Now, let's get into terminology. So, in thinking about, disability etiquette 101, terminology is a really big part of that. How do I refer to individuals with disabilities? How do I ensure that the information that I'm putting out, respects folks with disabilities? Or how do I fit, how do I show, that it is inclusive of individuals with disabilities? That's very important. I mean, as we move and as we kind of move from talking about the medical model and the social model, it's important to think about your terminology and what model does it reflect. Now, let's look at the first part of terminology, which is person first language. So many of us may be familiar with this. But a person first puts the person before the disability. So this approach is basically, putting emphasis on that an individual with a disability is just that, an individual first, and then their disability is second, if at all mentioned. So, the first words that you're going to hear are going to acknowledge the person who has a disability. So the student is on the autism spectrum. The young woman is utilizing a wheelchair. So we're going to remember that they are a person first, and we're going to make sure that we mention or lead with that first. And there is a photo of a young woman who's sitting on what looks to be a park bench, and she is looking at the camera, smiling. Now, identity first language is sort of the opposite of that. So, identity first language views having a disability as being prideful, as something to be celebrated, instead of feeling ashamed or embarrassed. Disabled is never a bad word. So you may lead with disabled person, non-disabled, wheelchair user. So, in thinking about identity first language, we want to celebrate that person's identity. Um, and there's a photo of me and Andra Levant, and she was one of the producers of Crip Camp. And she also has her own consulting business where, she ensures that folks with disabilities, that they are heard and that they have um, what they need regarding accessibility. And I have this photo here because Andra, is very proud to, say that she is disabled, that she utilizes a service animal who's in the photo as well, Goji. And she celebrates her identity as a disabled woman. So sometimes, I think what we have kind of been taught is that, certain words like disability or, disabled are bad. And that is not the truth, especially when we're thinking about identity first language. Now, how do I apply this? Some may say this is confusing. How do I know which one to use? Person first language centers on the person first, right? So we're putting the person first, then their disability, if we mention it at all. Identity first language centers on celebrating a person's disability, and we will lead with that when being referred to. So, a rule of thumb is if you're unsure, just ask, right? Imagine how it feels for someone to ask versus assume, something about you, especially for a person with a disability. You may ask something like, do you prefer person first language or identity first language when mentioning disability? And you may find that some people may say, it's not something that, I really think about. I'm just a student, or I'm just a client, that you're seeing who needs assistance with XYZ. And then you may, hear from someone who says, yeah, identify as disabled, proudly. So if you don't know, ask. And I think that's so important when thinking about a disability etiquette, because, we want to make sure that we are being inclusive, within our work environments. We want to make sure that we are being inclusive with our language. We want to ensure, that we are really thinking about people with disabilities beforehand versus as an afterthought. Um, so that's something that's really important, when we're talking about terminology, to ensure that you're incorporating in your day-to-day interactions with folks with disabilities. And there's a photo of someone who is reading Braille. They have a book open and they are using their hands to read the Braille that is inside of this book. Now, this was something when I was at my previous university that I had the opportunity to help create with a colleague. And it was a disability terminology in practice, something that we printed out and we had in various offices on campus. And it really just gives a, model to be able to refer back to. So, of course, when speaking to or about someone with a disability, it's important to make note of which terms are offensive, outdated, and inappropriate, right? Of course, we want to use person first or identity first language, but of course, there is some language that we just don't use at all. So it goes over person first language again. Remember, person first language is putting the person before the disability. It's using phrases like a person with a disability or a person who has autism versus disabled person or autistic person. And this approach is remember putting the person first, remembering that even before I have a disability, that I am a person. Um, Now, identity first language, remember this is celebrating that, disability is a part of my identity and I'm going to lead with that. So, disabled person, remember disabled is not a bad word. Wheelchair user, right? Some proponents of this style of language, it goes back to, instead of distancing myself from the word disability, I'm going to embrace that, right? I'm going to say, hey, this is a part of me. It's not me, as within my entirety, but it's a part of me that I'm proud of. And general rule of thumb, if you don't know, it is always okay to ask. Now, of course, in looking at this document, it breaks down person first language, identity first language, and it gives some examples. But of course, some things that are offensive and not recommended. Of course, the R word, that's something that is very offensive that we should never use, even in jest. I remember when I would work with best buddies during my undergraduate time, each year we would have a flush the R word and we would have actual toilet out there and we would write the word down on a sheet of paper and we would flush it down the toilet. And then I even did that as a teacher where I had the students write it on a sheet of paper and we throw it away. Just as a symbol, that this is an outdated and offensive word and that we never want to use it. Also, words like bound, or confined, nobody is bound to a wheelchair, nobody's confined to their wheelchair. For someone who does not have the use of their legs, or maybe their upward extremities, that would be very freeing. So it's never okay for us to, utilize words like that. Now, if that person chooses to use that language, then that's okay from them. But as far as from non-disabled folks, that's something that we should not be saying. Another popular one is suffers from, victim, or stricken with. That is not, appropriate, for us to say. Once again, if that person chooses to utilize that language, to describe their experience, then that's fine. But as far as us as non-disabled folks, assuming that someone is suffering or assuming that someone is a victim of, that would not be appropriate. So it's definitely, sometimes we have to look at our language and we have to, look at, some of these things. And it's always a good idea, to just take an inventory. What are some things that I'm using that are inappropriate? What are some things that I hear people saying around me all the time, that are offensive or inappropriate? And then over at the end column where it says offensive and not recommended, disabled, of course, that is a typo there. Of course, disabled is an okay word. Disability is an okay word, and thinking about terminology. Now let's talk about accessibility. So if you remember and going back to the objectives, we're talking about disability etiquette 101. It's important, that we think about accessibility and what that means, what that is, and how do we achieve that goal. So I want to read a definition of accessibility that I got from, I believe it's Illinois University. Um, but it's just a pretty easy one-liner that is a great reflection of what accessibility is. Accessibility is the degree to which a product, device, service, environment, or facility is usable by as many people as possible, including by persons with disabilities. So, when we think about accessibility, it's not just, necessarily about folks with disabilities, it's for everyone, because when things are accessible, everybody benefits, right? Especially individuals with disabilities. So, it's very important, that we think about access and what access looks like regarding different components within our, everyday work environments. Now, let's look at just a few barriers of accessibility and some things that maybe you've noticed within your own environment. So the first accessibility barrier is environmental. Buildings or other architecture that may be difficult to navigate for persons with disabilities, right? So as someone who worked, um, I'm at a university, I can think about times where the elevator was down, I can think about times where ramps were not at the correct height or width, and it was difficult for individuals and with mobility difficulties to navigate that. I can think of a time where a student could get up the ramp, but the button was right by the door. So this person would have to go back down the ramp after they pressed it so that it could open enough and then try to hurry up and go in before it closed. And that caused this individual to miss their courses. And these are not, easy fixes. What if the button is just not working, or what if, maybe it closes too quickly, things of that nature. And I'm talking about the accessible button. Um, so, think about the building that you're in. Think about how you went into, your work today. Was it, did you use a ramp? Was the elevator working, or do you even know um, and where the elevator is? Think about these things that maybe, some of us don't think about when it comes to, environments and accessibility. What about, are there enough accessible parking spaces? Do you even know, where they are? These are things that are environmental that sometimes we may forget and could make it, difficult for someone who, for someone to navigate and with a disability. Something else that's important is a technological. So websites, apps, or other web-based platforms. So, right now, especially post-COVID, apps and everything online, that is basically what a lot of us, are encountering. Everything's online now. And it may feel accessible, to some of us, but the reality is that oftentimes it's not. What if I'm using a screen reader and this platform is not letting me integrate that appropriately? What if there are pictures, and there's no accessible text for them so that my app could read that? Or, what if things like our learning management systems for those of us who have worked in education, What if simply the color contrast is just off and it's making it difficult for me to be able to assess the material? These are things that are really, really important, to think about. Just because it looks cool, just because it's online, doesn't mean that it is readily accessible. So it's important to, ask the folks who are, maybe trying to market these products to you, to see the specs for these products. Next thing, that's something that's very important is communication, right? Earlier I was talking about accessible parking spaces. And along with, accessible parking spaces, along with elevators, what about signage, right? How do I even know where the elevator is if there is no signage? How do I even know, where the ramp is if there is no signage? That's communication. And that's very important. We can have all these things, but if we don't even have signage that tells people where it is, it just kind of defeats the purpose, right? So think about, documents, print, languages, videos, that are sometimes not accessible. I can think about my time in higher education and that, videos are very important, for faculty and things of that nature. But what if the video doesn't have captioning, right? And a lot of times these things are easy fixes where you can just turn on the captioning option, but sometimes it may not be as easy. So yeah, you have this cool video that you want to integrate in the class. It's going to be so helpful. However, there's this barrier of there's no captioning. So that makes it difficult for someone who has a disability where they need captioning, and now they have to wait in order for this video to be transcribed or for us to try to figure out why there's no captioning and things of that nature. So, in thinking about, documents and thinking about, videos, it's important to remember that, yes, we want to communicate, accessibility, but we also want to make sure that it's just that it's accessible. And we talked about this in regards to the medical model and social model, but attitudinal barriers as far as accessibility. Preconceived notions that people with disabilities can only work in certain jobs, that they can only take certain classes, that they can only do fill in the blank, right? That is an attitudinal barrier that we all have to, check ourselves on. You may have to, ask yourself that, is this just the incorrect, barrier that I have within my head because I have not, seen an individual with a disability, in this type of environment before. An attitudinal barrier is something that you can't see, right? We can see a ramp that is off. We can see a website where the color contrast is not going to be the best for someone. We can see documents and print and videos, but we can't, necessarily see those preconceived notions. And those are things, that turn into microaggressions and so on and so forth. So it's very important, for us to think about barriers and for us to think about, etiquette, right? How can we, ensure that we are adhering to, etiquette when it comes to folks with disabilities in regards to these barriers? Um, how can we feel or how can we ensure that folks with disabilities feel comfortable regarding these three or regarding these four barriers? And this is not an exhaustive list. You may be thinking about another barrier right now that I did not mention. So these are just a few. But think about that. How can you in your own environment, in your everyday, work, or maybe it's personal life as well, how can you ensure that these things are adhered to for our disability population? Now, we've been talking about etiquette But let's just look at a few disabilities. This is not an exhaustive list, but just a few disabilities and what etiquette may look like. So let's kind of go through that right now. Now, mobility. So we talked about, I talked about the story of the ramp and how I had that student who was having great difficulty even just accessing the building to be able to get, to their course. But let's think about, mobility. Mobility is not just, a wheelchair. It could be a walker. It could be a cane. Maybe someone is using a CNI dog, but mobility is definitely something that's important once we think about folks with disabilities. Also, let's talk about some things that you definitely should not do, right? So first things first, don't touch a person's mobility equipment, right? That's an extension of their body. You just wouldn't want somebody coming up to you, touching you and things of that nature. So ask, if there was a situation where you needed to maybe help someone to do something, but you would ask, is it okay if I touch your wheelchair or touch your walker? You don't just want to go up and grab anything. You don't just want to push anybody. You don't just want to grab or pull anybody as well. Also in thinking about if you're speaking to someone who's using something like a wheelchair, right? You don't want to tower over them, make it natural, get eye level. Is it okay if I sit, next to you? But you don't want to tower over them. You don't want to, like lean over and put your hands on your legs. Be natural, pull up a chair. You don't want to kneel. Um, as well as you also want to be just sensitive about physical contact, kind of going back to not touching that person's mobility device, but also um not touching that person as well. If that's not something you wouldn't just typically go over and kind of push someone out the way or grab them. You don't want to do that for a person with a disability as well, just because they're utilizing a mobility device. And you probably can also think about some do's and don'ts and when it comes to mobility as well. Now, let's also, think about someone who is blind or low vision, someone who may be utilizing a white cane, someone who may be utilizing a seeing eye dog. Remember, a white cane is in it, is an extension of that person. You don't just want to grab it or touch it. I can think about a conference that I went to some years ago, and there was an individual who was blind, and he had an aide with him. The aide, and we were at dinner, so the aide read the menu. The aide let them know your water is on the right side, your tea is on the left side, your fork is on this side, the bread just came out, it's right in front of you. So they kind of narrated the scenery. But one thing I noticed was that they didn't just pick up anything and hand it to them. They told them where it was, and they left it open, to say, hey, if you need, if there's something that you need me to pass you or get you, please let me know, and I will, get that for you. But they didn't just, take over, so to say. They just narrated where things were, and they let the individual who was blind, low vision, get the things that they needed or ask for help. So I thought that that was very important. That also goes to, if you are, maybe interacting with someone who's blind, low vision, and they have an aide who's helping them, talk to the person, don't talk to the aide. That person is, simply there just to, help. But talk to the actual individual. Also, if there is a, time where the person may need to, maybe hold on to your arm or something of that nature, you want to offer it. I can think about that. I was with a student The student was blind. They did have a white cane. But where we were walking, the sidewalk was uneven, and then we were about to cross a busy street. So I asked him, would you like to hold onto my arm? The sidewalk is uneven, and we need to cross the street after. And they said, yes, thank you. So I extended my arm and we, walked, crossed over, and then he let my arm go and we walked, per usual. So that's something to think about as well. We don't want to guide a person, push them. We want to offer. We want to narrate the scene, the environment, so that they can know, what to look out for, what's happening, so on and so forth. Now, in thinking about someone who is deaf, it's very important, that when we're in event spaces and things of that nature, that we utilize captioning. With Zoom, you just click the button, and then the captioning pops up. We also want to make sure, that we are giving out, information on who exactly to contact if an interpreter is needed, right? I would say captioning too, but I feel like, captioning should be something that is just, kind of already provided. Think about somebody who's not deaf, but they're just in the back of the room and this room is so big and I can't hear you. Captioning helps everyone. So, but it is important that if an interpreter is needed for events and things like that, that is on the communication regarding that event, and it has the direct person on who to contact, so that an ASL interpreter can be provided. I also think about, if you're speaking to someone who is deaf, who is using an interpreter, speak to that person. Don't speak to the interpreter. They're just interpreting. You need to look and speak to that person. Also, keep your regular voice, level. You cannot yell, loud enough for someone who is deaf. You're not loud enough to yell to the entire room. Sometimes we see that at these presentations. Oh, I have a loud voice. Everybody can hear me. No, 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 no. That is not accessibility focus. And it's really discounting folks with disabilities who I cannot hear you because I am deaf. Doesn't have anything to do with your tone of voice. So that is something to definitely think about. Also, think about what equipment that you may have at your office. Someone who's deaf, just because they're deaf doesn't mean they know ASL. So even if you have someone within your office who knows ASL, how do you know that that person knows ASL? And in one of my offices, we had a device called an Ubi Duo, I believe, and it was like two computers, and you could turn them facing each other, but you could type and it would pop up on the other screen and vice versa. So that was something that we had within our office that actually came in handy, and it was pretty cool. And a lot of these things don't cost like a whole lot of money. Of course, now we have our phones and things of that nature that we could just open up a text message or something like that. But it's also good to just have certain things like this lying around in the office. You don't need it until you do, right? Communication is another disability, especially when we think about, functional limitations. For folks with disabilities, communication is one of those a limitation. So think about someone who may have cerebral palsy and they don't have control over their vocal cords. So it may affect their speech. So in thinking about communication, it's important for us, of course, to, be patient. If you don't understand what the person is saying, it's okay. Ask the person to repeat themselves and then repeat back to them, to ensure that you got the information correct. Don't try to finish the person's sentences or, speak over them. I think it's sometimes, just natural for us to do that. And if the conversation is not working, go to a quieter area. I'm sorry, it's kind of noisy out here. Would you mind if we stepped into my office? Maybe you're still having difficulty. I'm sorry, I'm having some difficulty. I'm hearing you. And I want to make sure that I'm able to assist you. Would you mind writing this down? Or would you mind typing this for me, something of that nature, but you don't just want to give up. So it's important, in situations like this, just be patient, right? We're going to get to whatever it is that you need. So we just want to make that person feel comfortable. We don't want them to get flustered. And we don't want them to, not tell us on what it is that they need. So that's something that's very important to think about when we are talking about communication. Now, let's do a quick recap. In general, relax, enjoy getting to know, your colleague, clients, whoever that population is, or guests, as people and as professionals, right? Remember, before we even think about a disability, they're a person first, so how can we, just relax and enjoy getting to know one another? Ask before you provide assistance. Oh, and I just realized that I had some pictures on those other slides. So as I was going through the various disabilities on the mobility, and I'm just going to go back a second here. On the mobility slide, there's three individuals. They're sitting down, they're working. There is a male who is in a wheelchair for blind low vision. There is an individual who's walking downstairs. They are utilizing their white cane. And then for individuals who are deaf, there's a little boy, and then there is an older male. They are reading a book and they are signing as they're reading the book. And then the last slide was communication. And there's just a group of four individuals. It looks like they're at work and they are talking to one another. Now, and getting back to just some in general tips, ask before you provide assistance. Remember, I talked about the individual who was blind and we were at dinner, and the aide narrated everything. They didn't take over. They let them know where each thing was, and they left it open, for the person to ask if they needed additional assistance. So always ask before you provide assistance. Don't assume that a person with, an apparent disability needs assistance. So don't assume that just because someone is utilizing a wheelchair or a walker that they need assistance, right? Folks with disabilities know what works for them and what doesn't. They are the experts. So offer your assistance in broad terms. If you need help with anything, I'll be over here, or my name is XYZ. Just please let me know. Okay, and go about, as you would typically. But don't assume that. Think in terms of disability pride. So, using, language such as wheelchair user, nobody is confined to a wheelchair, um, things of that nature. This is a person who utilizes a wheelchair, you know. So it's very important for us to remember, disabled is not a bad word. For us to remember those preconceived notions, for us to remember the social model, because those things really help too. When we think about the social medical model, when we think about disability history, when we learn these things and we see the importance of them, these are things that help to, increase our disability, knowledge, as well as our disability etiquette. So just some simple things for you to just remember. Now, how does this apply to counselors? How does this apply to, maybe you're not a counselor, maybe you, work with folks with disabilities in some other capacity, but how does this apply, to you? Sometimes I think, we have just this view of, well, I never come into contact with XYZ. So why do I need to know that? But the truth is, this is all of our responsibility. And that's what helps to create a more inclusive environment. Now, your responsibility. What is my responsibility, you ask? So, the first one is to dispel stereotypes, right? There are many inappropriate stereotypes about folks with disabilities, right? We talked about that derogatory language as well as ideas, right? So speak up, become an advocate when these things are presented. There are many words that are just offensive that people just use in everyday language. Speak up about those things. My friends already know, don't use the R word around her. Like she's gonna say something. So how can you speak up regarding whatever that is to just dispel those things? um the next one is inclusive spaces. How inclusive is your space? Do you have visuals of folks with disabilities and not just someone who's utilizing a mobility aid, right? What other inclusive visuals do you have within your brochures or other materials? How do you broadcast or advertise your office, or how you in this presentation I have SWDs, students with disabilities, but maybe it's clients with disabilities, individuals with disabilities, whatever that is for you. But how do you how does your office advertise, or how do you specifically interact with this population? Another important, responsibility is our clients. So I remember when I was working in higher ed, I will always get folks, who would call, faculty. Yeah, well, I had one of your students, and I'm like, my student? I haven't even seen this person before. You've seen them more than I have. This is not my student. These are our students. These are our clients. This is our community, right? So folks with disabilities do not just belong to certain type of practitioners. They belong to all of us. So it's very important to think about that, especially when thinking about the language, that we're using to describe those folks. So important to just remember that. Dispel stereotypes, inclusive spaces, and our clients. That's what our responsibility is. And this is how you create a plan, for your own environment. This is what your plan looks like, right? It has these components. Now, what are you taking away from this presentation? I want to know, what are you taking away from this presentation? Is it the history of disability? Is it the medical and social model? Is it the etiquette, regarding some of the types of disabilities that we talked about? Is it terminology? What are you taking away from this? I would encourage you, to write that down. Is it the plan that you're going to use to dispel stereotypes, to create inclusive spaces, to remember that these are our clients? What are you taking away from this presentation? Definitely write that down somewhere, share it with someone. Now, pop quiz. I told you I was a teacher, right? So pop quiz. The first question is, what are the differences between person first language and identity first language, right? What's the difference? Remember, person first language is putting the person first, an individual with a disability. Identity first language is celebrating disability as a part of identity, wheelchair user, disabled. Um, Question number 2, describe the difference between the medical and social models. So think about that. The medical model was used to, see a person with a disability as needing to be fixed or a cure, discounting that person. They don't know, what's best for them. Someone else does. They need to be fixed, XYZ. The social model, remember that is that, wait a minute, my disability is not the issue. It's the environmental barriers. It's the attitudinal barriers. It's the preconceived notions, it's not my disability. And because of those things, yeah, they may cause, extra, issues like anxiety, depression, things of that nature. Question 3, how many adults in the US will have some type of disability? So that was within the first few slides from the CDC that talks about disability and health. And in case you forgot, that was 1 in 4. So that was 1 in 4. 1 in 4 of adults in the US have some type of disability. 1 in 4 of adults with disabilities do not have a usual healthcare provider. 12.8% of US adults have a cognition disability with serious difficulty concentrating, remembering, or making decisions. So that was one of those opening statistics that was in the beginning. Now, question number 4, list at least one responsibility that counselors have to individuals with disabilities. So, we talked about those 3 things on the last slide. We talked about dispelling stereotypes. How will you dispel stereotypes? How will you speak up when you hear something that is not appropriate, right? How will you speak up when you can tell that somebody has a preconceived, notion? And what would that look like for you? Something to think about, because a lot of times those things come up and we don't know how to navigate them. But go ahead and think about, what's your game plan the next time that you're in a situation and you have to dispel a stereotype. Inclusive spaces, think about your work environment. How is it inclusive for folks with disabilities? Can someone who has a mobility disability even access the building and comfortably, right? Think about that. What is that ramp situation looking like? Does the accessible door even work? Does the elevator even work? Do you even have an elevator? Think about these things. What visuals do you have within your work environment that are inclusive of folks with disabilities, right? Also remembering our clients, these folks with disabilities do not just belong to one type of practitioner. These are our clients. They're our family, they're our friends, they're our colleagues, they're our neighbors. Folks with disabilities are not just set to, this type of person. So think about that. And remember, let that guide your plan for creating a plan to equitably interact with folks with disabilities within your environment. The last question is, in regards to disability etiquette, what are some general tips in interacting with individuals with disabilities? So remember, we talked about mobility aids. Don't touch them. And thinking about something like a CNI dog. Yes, the dog can be as cute as it can be. Please don't touch the animal. It is working. You don't want to be distracting to it. Please don't do that. There may be a time for you to pet that person's animal. You can ask them, I just really love your dog. Is there a time where I can pet them when he or she is not working? But don't just go up and pet the animal. Remember, ask first. A person with a disability is an expert, right? They know what works for them. They know what does not work for them. You don't have to assume anything. Just offer help like you would anybody else. If there's something that you need, please let me know. I'll be over here. Don't forget, use a microphone when you are in events. No, you cannot yell loud enough. Please don't do that. Don't say that. Use a microphone, ask for the microphone, bring one with you, make sure that you have captioning, make sure that folks know who to ask if they need an ASL interpreter. There should be that direct line, that direct email for them to reach out. So in going back to our objectives for this presentation, the first one was that attendees will be able to define accessibility for individuals with disabilities. Attendees will recognize situations where individuals with disabilities may feel uncomfortable, within that work environment. Think about those barriers to accessibility. And then the last one was to develop a plan to address disability etiquette within your own environment. So in thinking about, those learning objectives, I hope that you will be able, to, utilize those objectives to improve your own day-to-day, work or personal environments. Now, if you would like to reach out to me, you can scan the QR code at the top of this slide. And that is where you would be taken to my YouTube channel. I do have a YouTube. We are over 2,500 subscribers strong, so I hope to see you over there. Don't forget about my blog. I'll be updating it soon, dugandigsdisability.org. Or if you'd like to email me for any other questions, miss.dugan at dugandigsdisability.org. And I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I greatly thank you for taking the time to view it. I hope it was helpful to you, and I hope that you will share this information with someone. And once again, thank you very much. And I will see you all during another presentation. Bye.